The camera pans across a serene park bathed in the golden hues of a late afternoon sun. Children laugh in the distance, their joyful voices mixing with the chirps of birds and the rustle of leaves swaying in the gentle breeze. Joggers move at a steady pace, couples stroll hand in hand, and a few people sit on benches, soaking in the tranquility. It's a perfect picture of peace, until it isn't. Near an old wooden bench, a man sits quietly, his presence unassuming yet dignified. His silver hair glints in the sunlight, and his hands rest on a simple cane that tells stories of wear and time. Dressed in a neat sweater and slacks, the elderly man gazes out at the lake, lost in thought. He doesn't seem to notice the shadow looming behind him, the unmistakable figure of authority closing in. At first glance, the officer appears to be just another part of the park's routine, a guardian of public safety, ensuring rules are followed. But something feels off. His body language is tense, his steps deliberate, and his gaze sharp. He zeroes in on the old man, his eyes narrowing as if trying to identify a threat that isn't there. "Hey," the officer's voice booms, shattering the peaceful ambience. Heads turn, curious and cautious. The elderly man startles slightly, shifting in his seat, and looks up with a mix of surprise and confusion. The officer's tone is sharp, the kind that demands compliance before explanations. "What are you doing here?" The man blinks, clearly taken aback. "I'm just sitting," he replies, his voice steady but laced with a hint of unease. "That bench is reserved for patrons of the park cafe. Do you have a receipt?" The question hangs in the air, absurd and invasive. A few onlookers exchange uneasy glances. Others keep walking, pretending not to notice. But not everyone. Unbeknownst to the officer, someone is watching. Someone whose camera lens is already zoomed in, capturing every word, every action. A quiet observer nestled among the trees, recording the unfolding encounter with a steady hand and a heavy heart. The elderly man's brow furrows. "I didn't know there was a rule. I'm just resting my legs for a moment." The officer crosses his arms, his stance widening. "Rules are rules. Either show me proof you're a cafe customer or move along." The tension is palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. The elderly man hesitates, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't mean any trouble. I've been coming to this park for years." "Then you should know better," the officer snaps, cutting him off. From the tree line, the unseen observer adjusts the angle, their camera capturing not just the interaction but the small details, the clench of the officer's jaw, the quiver in the old man's hand as he grits his cane, the way passers-by seem to shrink away from the scene. The observer knows this moment isn't just about a bench. It's about something much bigger, something deeply rooted and painfully familiar. They stay hidden, their presence undetected, but their determination grows with each passing second. As the officer's voice rises, drawing more attention, a quiet question lingers in the air. Asterisk, how far will this go? Asterisk. And just as the officer steps closer, his voice sharp with authority, the observer makes a decision. But what happens next will leave you questioning everything you think you know about what's fair, what's right, and who's truly watching. Stay with us to see how this story unfolds, because sometimes the most powerful truth comes from the quietest witness. The officer's boots crunch on the gravel as he takes a step closer, his eyes locking onto the elderly man, who now stands with a slight tremor in his legs. The calmness of the park, once a haven of peace, now feels charged, like the stillness before a storm. The elderly man, his back slightly hunched with age, looks around at the onlookers. Some are now stopping to watch, others pretending to go about their business, but keeping an eye on the unfolding scene. It's as if everyone knows something is wrong, but is unsure of what to do about it. The man grips his cane a little tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble, officer. I just wanted to sit down for a while. My knees aren't what they used to be." The officer doesn't respond right away. He simply stares down at the man, his expression unreadable. It's almost as if he's measuring something, testing the man's resolve, perhaps. The old man's hands begin to shake, but he hides it quickly, choosing instead to straighten his posture, as though to appear stronger than he feels. His eyes dart around, taking in the faces of those watching. He's seen many of them before, familiar faces from the neighborhood, from the park, but they all avert their gaze, no one willing to step in. It's the same old story. People turn a blind eye, just as they always have. The officer steps even closer now, close enough that the elderly man can smell the faint scent of his uniform, the starch and the crispness. "I told you, move along, or I'll have to write you up." The elderly man's voice cracks slightly as he replies, "I don't understand. I'm not hurting anyone. I've been coming to this park for years. I know the rules, but I didn't know about this one." The officer's eyes narrow. He seems to take a small amount of satisfaction in the discomfort he's causing. Ignorance isn't an excuse. It's at this moment that the observer's camera catches a slight shift in the officer's demeanor. A flash of impatience, maybe even something darker behind the cold professionalism. It's subtle but unmistakable. The observer has seen enough to know that what started as an innocent misunderstanding is now turning into something more. The elderly man, tired and weary, doesn't seem to realize it yet, but this isn't just about a bench or a rule anymore. There's something much deeper at play. The observer has been watching for a while now, having noticed the officer earlier in the day, patrolling the park with a strange intensity. At first, they thought it was just another ordinary patrol, but as time passed, something about the officer's movements seemed off. He wasn't just walking, he was scanning, his eyes darting around as if looking for someone or something. And now it's clear that he's found it. The elderly man's discomfort grows. His voice trembles as he responds, "Please, officer, I don't want any trouble. I'll leave if that's what you want, but..." "No, you're not leaving." "Not yet," the officer interrupts sharply. There's an edge to his voice now, one that wasn't there at the beginning. He steps even closer, his body blocking the man from any path to escape, from any chance of retreat. It feels as if the entire situation is tightening like a noose around the old man, and he's running out of air. The camera captures it all, the officer's clenched jaw, the elderly man's increasingly nervous eyes, the faint quiver in his hands. The tension in the park has shifted. What was once just a quiet afternoon has become a charged standoff, a moment frozen in time, and yet no one seems willing to break the silence. It's as if everyone knows that stepping in would mean more than just confronting the officer. It would mean confronting something bigger, something more dangerous than they're prepared to deal with. As the elderly man takes a step back, his feet stumbling slightly, the officer takes a step forward. It's as if he's toying with him now, pushing him just to see how far he'll bend before breaking. "Do you have an ID on you?" the officer asks, his voice thick with authority. The elderly man hesitates. His hands tremble even more now as he fumbles through his pockets, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He's shaking, not from fear alone, but from the weight of years, from the feeling that things are slipping away faster than he can keep up. He hands over the ID, his fingers now visibly shaking, the paper thin and yellowed with age. The officer snatches it from him quickly, scanning it with an almost clinical detachment. He doesn't say a word at first, his eyes moving across the details, making the elderly man feel even smaller than he already does. The air feels oppressive, heavy with the unspoken words swirling between them. Behind the camera, the observer's finger hovers over the record button, their grip tightening around the lens. They've seen enough in their lifetime to know that moments like these don't just pass without consequence. They know the history, the way things like this have played out before. The officer's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, a cycle of power and control that has been going on for generations. And now it's playing out in front of them. The elderly man shifts again, his discomfort palpable. He doesn't want to make a scene, doesn't want to escalate things. He just wants to go home. "Please, officer, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I'll leave now, just let me go." But the officer isn't ready to let go just yet. The power in his position is too intoxicating, too easy to wield. The tension in the air thickens, and the observer knows the moment is about to change. Something is going to happen, and they can feel it in their bones. Just as the officer reaches into his pocket to pull out something, maybe a ticket, maybe something else, the wind shifts. The elderly man's gaze flickers to the side, and for a brief moment, the officer's attention follows. The observer, still hidden, catches it all on camera. The moment the officer's focus shifts, just enough for the elderly man to make his move. What happens next will leave everyone wondering, is this the breaking point, or just the beginning of something darker, something more troubling than anyone could have expected? The camera continues to roll, and the tension in the park grows thicker with every passing second. The elderly man glances around, the movement so subtle, yet telling. His gaze lands on the small group of people gathered at the edge of the park. They've been watching this entire exchange, but none have stepped in. They shift uncomfortably, clearly feeling the weight of the moment, yet none make a move to intervene. The elderly man's eyes linger on them for a brief second, a silent plea. But they look away. It's as if they're afraid to do anything, as if stepping in would somehow make them a target. Maybe they don't want to risk the trouble. Maybe they're used to turning a blind eye. The old man's heart sinks as he realizes that once again he's alone in this. The officer, still holding the ID, takes a slow step forward. The old man instinctively takes a small step back. The officer's eyes flash with irritation, as if this small retreat is a personal affront. His face hardens, and he exhales sharply, as if he's been holding his breath for too long. There's something cold and distant about his demeanor now, like he's not just dealing with an individual, but enforcing some invisible order, some unwritten rule that has nothing to do with the bench or the cafe. It's as if the officer sees the old man as less than human, just a problem to be eradicated, a nuisance to be dealt with. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the officer says, his voice low, but laced with a thinly veiled threat. "Just cooperate, and this will be over." The elderly man's breath catches. He's been down this road before, had his fair share of run-ins with authority in his younger years, but never like this. Never in his golden years, when his body is tired, his mind slower, and his patience worn thin. He tries to steady himself, but the words feel like lead in his mouth. "I'm not looking for trouble," he mutters again, quieter now, but his voice trembles under the weight of years, of battles fought in silence. The officer doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifts his weight, scanning the park again. His eyes land on the camera held by the observer, hidden in the trees. The officer's gaze sharpens, and he looks toward the shadows for a long moment. It's almost as if he's aware that there are eyes watching, but he doesn't break the tension. Instead, he seems to stand a little taller, his posture becoming more rigid, more authoritative. For a brief moment, the elderly man seems to catch the shift in the officer's focus. His heart races. A feeling of dread creeps up his spine. His mind flashes back to other encounters with the law, with authority figures who never cared to listen, to understand. He's been here before, but this time something feels different. The air around them has thickened, charged with an invisible current of power and control. The observer, now feeling the weight of their role, tightens their grip on the camera. They've seen the officer notice them. There's no doubt in their mind that the officer knows he's being watched. But what does that mean? Will the officer back off, realizing that his actions are being documented, or will he double down, further cementing his control over the situation? The observer doesn't know what will happen next, but they're starting to realize something much more troubling. This moment isn't just about a bench or an old man. It's about the systems in place that allow these moments to unfold again and again. The elderly man's chest tightens. He feels like a small bird caught in a net, unable to break free. His mind races, his body frozen in place. He looks at the officer, then back at the camera. He knows that whatever happens next, it's being recorded. He wants to believe that someone will step in, that someone will care, but as time passes, his doubts grow. The camera lens is like a magnifying glass, amplifying every small movement, every slight shift in the officer's posture. And yet, The park is still eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of children playing and birds chirping, sounds that seem miles away from the tension brewing in this small corner. The officer steps even closer, this time deliberately invading the elderly man's personal space. The old man stiffens, his heart thudding in his chest. The officer's eyes bore into his, a cold, unyielding stare. "You're not going anywhere," the officer growls, his words dripping with menace. It's not a suggestion, it's a command. The elderly man's legs tremble slightly as he fights to keep his balance, his mind screaming for him to move, to walk away, but his body refuses. It's then that the observer makes a choice. They press record, and the camera starts rolling, capturing every word, every move. They know that what they're witnessing is a pivotal moment, one that could mean more than just the harassment of an elderly man. It could be the breaking point of something much larger, something that people have tried to ignore for far too long. The elderly man, still unable to find his voice, takes another step back, his back now pressed against the old wooden bench. The officer's expression hardens as he steps forward again, just a bit too close. "I said you're not going anywhere," he repeats, his tone harsh. In that moment, the elderly man seems to lose whatever little resolve he had left. His face softens with defeat, and for a split second, he looks like a child. Small, vulnerable, and forgotten. His voice, when it comes, is barely a whisper. "Please, I'm too old for this." The officer doesn't flinch. He stands tall, towering over the frail man in front of him. Age doesn't matter, he spits, his voice dripping with disdain. "You don't get to make the rules here." Behind the camera, the observer's hands shake, not from fear, but from the growing realization of just how dangerous this situation has become. It's no longer just a case of an officer overstepping his bounds. It's a display of power that has been unchecked for too long, a pattern that stretches back through history, fueled by a system that thrives on control, fear, and silence. And still, no one intervenes, no one speaks up. The elderly man's breath quickens as his eyes dart around the park, hoping for someone, anyone, to come to his aid. But all he gets in return are empty faces, averted gazes, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The officer, sensing the man's defeat, seems to take a step back, just for a moment. But the tension lingers in the air, thick and unyielding. There's a sense that something is about to snap, but no one knows what it will be. The observer's camera continues to roll, capturing the moments that no one else will ever see. What happens next could change everything, or it could just be another chapter in a story that's been repeating itself for far too long. The questions hang in the air like a cloud that refuses to dissipate. What will the officer do? What will the elderly man do? And most importantly, who will be brave enough to stop it before it's too late? The officer's heavy breathing is the only sound that breaks the oppressive silence between them. His eyes flick from the elderly man's shaking hands to the camera now recording everything, capturing his every move. It's a subtle shift, but the observer can feel it. A change in the air, a rising tension that makes the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. The officer knows he's being watched, and yet he doesn't back down. Instead, he steps even closer to the elderly man, his boots scraping the gravel with every step. The old man stands frozen, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. His heart races in his chest, and for a moment he can hardly breathe. He's not sure if it's the weight of the officer's stare or the sheer injustice of the situation, but everything around him feels like it's closing in. The park, once a place of solace, now feels like a cage, a place where he has no control, no escape. He glances once more at the onlookers. They're still there watching, some with phones in hand, but no one makes a move to step in. Their eyes are wide, some looking away, others too afraid to confront the situation. The elderly man feels the sting of isolation, the silence of complicity ringing in his ears. He's always known that people are afraid to get involved, but in this moment, it's as if he's been abandoned entirely. Alone in the face of this aggression, he feels smaller than ever before. The officer doesn't seem to care about the crowd watching anymore. His focus is entirely on the elderly man, as if trying to break him, to push him into submission. "You're going to listen to me," he growls, his voice low and menacing. "You'll do what I say, or you'll regret it." The elderly man, too weak to argue, shifts his weight nervously. He's been through so much in his life, faced down so many challenges, but this feels different. This feels personal. His whole life he's fought against the tide, against systems that didn't care about him or his struggles. But now, in the face of this officer, it feels as though everything he's ever known has failed him. His knees ache, his back hurts, and his heart is heavy with the weight of his years. The officer takes a step closer, so close now that the old man can feel his breath on his skin. His hands tremble as he grits his cane, but he refuses to move, refuses to be intimidated any further. But his body betrays him, his legs too weak to hold him up. His breath comes in shallow gasps, and he knows if he doesn't speak, the situation could spiral out of control. "I'm not going anywhere," he says, his voice hoarse but defiant. He wants to believe that if he stands his ground, something will change. That maybe, just maybe, the officer will see reason. But deep down, he knows that this moment isn't about reason, it's about power. The officer stares at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. For a heartbeat, the old man wonders if the officer will just turn away, walk off, leave him in peace. But instead, the officer's jaw tightens, and he reaches for his radio. The click of the button seems to echo in the old man's ears. Something inside the elderly man snaps. The realization hits him like a wave. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is something far darker, something he's seen before, but never quite so close to home. He's not just being harassed, he's being singled out, and the officer knows it. The officer is waiting for him to break, to make a mistake, so that he can escalate things, so that he can punish him for simply existing in this space. The observer's heart pounds in their chest as they watch the scene unfold, the camera capturing every second. They know the officer can't see them, but they can't help but wonder. What will happen if the officer does something worse? The officer's hand rests on his belt, his fingers twitching near his weapon. The observer's pulse quickens as the tension mounts. There's no denying it now. This situation is teetering on the edge, and they can't look away. The elderly man's mind races. His breath comes faster now, his chest tightening with every passing second. He knows he's running out of time. If he doesn't act soon, things will get worse. But what can he do? He's old, tired, and fragile, with nothing left to fight with but his dignity. It's all he has. But will it be enough? "Please," the old man whispers, the words trembling in his throat, but they come up weak, almost inaudible. "Please just let me go." The officer's lips curl into a slight, almost imperceptible smirk. It's not a smile, but something colder, more calculated. "You think I'm going to just let you walk away?" He sneers, leaning in even closer, as if to make sure the man knows just how powerless he is. The elderly man, his body aching from the strain, finally looks at the officer with a look that's almost pleading. He feels the weight of every year, every injustice, every moment of his life where he's been treated as less than human. He's been pushed around for so long, but this moment is different. He can't explain why, but something inside him stirs. He refuses to let the officer take his last shred of dignity. The camera continues to roll, its lens capturing every detail. The officer's hand hovers dangerously near his belt again, but the elderly man doesn't flinch. He's done flinching. The observer's hand tightens around the camera, the heart in their throat, wondering how much further this will go. The air is thick with anticipation, with the knowing that whatever happens next could change everything. The officer's eyes flick to the camera again, this time with a noticeable shift. There's a moment where his demeanor cracks, just for a fraction of a second. The observer can see it. His fingers twitch, and the air between him and the elderly man seems to thicken. And then, with one swift motion, the officer reaches for his radio again, the tension in the park escalating as if the entire place is holding its breath. The observer can feel it too, the moment before everything erupts. And then it happens. A single word from the officer. A command that seems too simple, too innocent, but in this moment, it carries the weight of something far more dangerous. Something that will determine the outcome of this encounter. Something that could change the course of this day, or set it on a path no one can stop. The question now is whether anyone will step in before it's too late. The air crackles with the possibility of what's to come. The officer's voice cuts through the silence once again, sharp and commanding. "Step away from him," he says, directing the command not toward the elderly man, but to the crowd that has gathered, the ones who have been watching in uncomfortable silence. The observer, still hidden in the shadows with the camera rolling, feels their stomach drop. They thought they understood the situation, thought they knew how things would unfold. But now, a chill runs through them as they realize this is not a random encounter. This is something more methodical. The officer has sensed the presence of witnesses, and he's not about to let this moment slip away. The officer's sudden command to the onlookers feels like a signal, a warning, that any attempt to intervene will be met with force. The crowd hesitates, unsure of what to do. Their phones are still out, recording, but there's a palpable fear in the air. They've seen the officer's aggression, felt the tension rise, and now they know the stakes have escalated. No one dares speak, but their eyes dart nervously from one another. They know what's at risk, but they're paralyzed by the fear of becoming part of the conflict themselves. It's as if the officer has drawn an invisible line, and anyone who dares to cross it will be treated as a threat. The elderly man stands motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. He's seen the officer's hand move toward his belt again, but this time, it's not just a subtle gesture. It's deliberate, slow, as though the officer is preparing to escalate this further. The old man feels a bead of sweat drip down his forehead. He's trapped. His entire body trembles now, not from the chill of the air, but from the overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had hoped that something, anything, would stop this before it got worse, but now it seems as though the situation is spinning out of control. From behind the camera, the observer watches in growing horror, unable to turn away. The officer's eyes scan the crowd once more, this time landing on a young woman standing off to the side. She has her phone raised, the camera pointing directly at the officer, capturing everything. The officer's gaze locks on hers with a cold intensity, and for a moment, time seems to freeze. Then, in a move that feels almost too fast to register, the officer strides toward her. The crowd parts like the Red Sea, fear spreading in waves. The young woman's face pales as the officer approaches, her phone trembling in her hands. She stumbles backward, trying to retreat, but the officer grabs her arm before she can make it more than a step. "You think you can just record me, huh?" he growls, his voice low and threatening. The observer feels their chest tighten. They know this is bad. They don't know how bad it's about to get. They want to shout, to warn the woman, but their voice is stuck in their throat. The officer's grip tightens on her arm, and for a moment, it looks like he might drag her off to deal with her separately. The crowd collectively holds its breath, unsure whether this is the officer's way of asserting dominance, or if he's about to cross a line that can't be undone. But then, as if sensing the rising danger, the young woman suddenly looks directly at the officer, her eyes filled with a mix of defiance and fear. She holds her phone up higher, the screen still recording. The officer freezes for a moment, his hand still gripping her arm, but then something in his face changes. There's a flicker of hesitation, the briefest moment of doubt that anyone could miss. He looks at the phone again, and in that split second, the entire atmosphere shifts. The realization settles in. This isn't just about an old man in a park anymore. This is about the power of documentation, the power of witnesses who refuse to be silent. The officer steps back abruptly, his jaw clenched, and he releases the woman's arm with a forceful push. She stumbles but keeps her feet, her phone still pointed at him, recording every moment. The officer glares at her, his lips pressed tightly together as if he's holding back a storm. For a moment, the air is thick with tension, And then the officer turns, muttering under his breath, as if trying to regain control of the situation. He walks back toward the elderly man, but the power dynamic has shifted. And then, just as the officer is about to speak again, something unexpected happens. The elderly man, still standing frozen by the bench, suddenly takes a slow, deliberate step forward. His voice is low but clear, carrying across the quiet park. "If you want to arrest me, then arrest me," he says, his words steady despite the trembling in his hands. "But know this, I will not be silenced. Not today." The officer halts, his eyes flicking to the old man, then back to the crowd. For a moment, it seems like the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see what will happen next. The observers' hands tremble as they grip the camera, their mind racing. This is the turning point, the moment where everything changes. The elderly man's defiance isn't just an act of personal resistance, it's a spark that could ignite something much bigger. The officer's face flushes with rage, but instead of responding immediately, he shifts his weight, his eyes darting to the growing crowd. The people around them, once passive observers, are now more than just witnesses. The air is electric with the weight of what could happen next. The officer's hand moves toward his radio again, but there's a hesitation now, a moment of uncertainty. It's clear that he's aware of the risk he's taking, aware that this could blow up in ways he can't control. The elderly man stands taller, his voice now ringing with quiet authority. "Do your worst," he says, locking eyes with the officer, and for the first time, the old man's strength shines through. "But you can't take my dignity." The officer's jaw clenches, and he seems to hesitate. His eyes flick to the camera again, then back to the crowd. The stakes are higher now than ever before, and the world feels like it's on the edge of a precipice. The observer, camera still rolling, knows that whatever happens next will be a turning point, not just for this moment, but for everything that has led up to it. The officer takes another step forward, his hand still hovering over his radio. But something in the air shifts. There's an undeniable change. It's as though the old man's words have carved a line in the sand, a point of no return. For a moment, time seems to slow down. The crowd holds its breath, watching, waiting for the next move. The officer's eyes flick from the elderly man to the growing number of witnesses around them. He seems to realize, in that instant, that this situation is no longer just about power, it's about control. And for once, the control is slipping from his grasp. The elderly man stands taller now, his back straight despite the ache in his bones, his cane resting loosely by his side. His voice is quieter but firm, carrying across the park with a strength that surprises everyone around him. "You're not going to win this. Not today," he repeats, as if reinforcing the truth that has been buried within him for so many years. The officer's lips twitch, and for a moment, it looks like he might lash out, but instead, he takes a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he assesses the situation. There's a tension in the air, a charged feeling of something about to explode. But then, in a stunning turn, the officer steps back. He doesn't radio for backup. He doesn't escalate the situation further. He just steps back, looking at the elderly man as if trying to figure out his next move. The crowd stirs, the onlookers who have been silent for so long now exchanging glances. The officer's withdrawal is unexpected, leaving a sense of confusion in its wake. What happened to the anger, the threat of violence? What made him hesitate? The elderly man's eyes flick to the camera once again. The camera that has been recording every moment, every glance, every word. He knows that this is bigger than him now. It's not just about standing up for himself, it's about standing up for everyone who's ever been silenced. It's about reminding the world that people will no longer stay quiet when they're treated like they don't matter. The officer's eyes follow his gaze, and in that brief moment, it's as if he understands that the camera isn't just a tool, it's a weapon. It's the very thing that can undo everything he's trying to protect. And then, just as the tension seems to hang in the air, something unexpected happens. The elderly man lowers his gaze, his shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the moment has caught up to him. For a heartbeat, it seems like he might collapse, like the stress of it all has finally taken its toll. But just as quickly, he regains his composure. His eyes harden again. It's a quiet defiance, a sense of resolve that goes beyond this one encounter. But the real twist comes when, for the first time, someone steps forward. A voice cuts through the silence. It's a voice the elderly man doesn't expect to hear. It's soft, almost apologetic, but firm in its resolve. "He's right," the voice says, drawing attention from the crowd. The officer's eyes snap to the new person, and the entire park seems to freeze again. The person who steps forward is a woman, one of the bystanders who had been recording, one of the silent witnesses. She lowers her phone now, no longer filming, but speaking with a calm authority that makes the officer pause. "You can't keep doing this," she continues, her voice steady. "Not when everyone is watching." The officer looks at her, his expression unreadable. He seems unsure of what to do next, his gaze flicking between the elderly man and the woman. The park, which just moments ago had felt like a battleground, now seems filled with possibility. There's a shifting energy in the air, something tangible, something that suggests that the power imbalance might actually be changing. The officer takes a step back, his hand hovering at his side as though he's lost his footing. It's a fleeting moment, but it's enough to shift the tide. The crowd begins to stir, a murmur running through the park. Some people move closer, emboldened by the woman's words, while others stay back, still wary of what might happen next. But the shift is undeniable. The officer is no longer in control of the narrative. His earlier threats are now met with defiance, and the realization that his actions are being seen by a larger audience is starting to sink in. But just as the officer starts to regain his composure, there's a sudden shout from the edge of the park. A new figure appears. Another officer, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He strides toward them, his presence commanding attention. The first officer looks at him, his shoulders tense, but the new officer doesn't seem to acknowledge the situation the way he expected. Instead, the new officer's eyes flick to the camera, and then to the elderly man, before he turns to the officer who's been harassing him. "What's going on here?" the new officer asks, his tone measured but firm. The first officer hesitates, glancing back at the elderly man and the growing crowd. He opens his mouth, but the words don't come out. The officer's hesitation hangs in the air like a question that has no answer. It's a strange thing, the way the balance of power shifts in that moment. The second officer looks at the first, then at the crowd, and finally at the woman who had spoken up. There's a long pause. The seconds stretch into what feels like an eternity, and then, in an unexpected twist, the second officer turns to the elderly man. "You're free to go," he says, his voice calm but resolute. The first officer looks at him, stunned, his face darkening with frustration. The elderly man blinks, not quite able to process what's happening, but he feels the weight of the words. He nods slowly, his body still trembling, but there's a flicker of something else in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. The crowd starts to disperse, some still glancing back at the officers, others breathing a sigh of relief. The camera captures the last few moments of the encounter as the elderly man takes a cautious step away from the bench, his head held high, his cane tapping against the pavement with a sense of finality. But as he walks away, something in the back of his mind stirs. He knows this won't be the last time he faces something like this. He knows that the fight isn't over, not by a long shot. And as the crowd slowly melts into the distance, the officer watches him go, his hand twitching at his side. The resolution of this confrontation might be over, but the story, the fight for justice, is far from finished. The twist, the unspoken tension, lingers in the air. The officer's hesitation wasn't just a sign of weakness. It was a glimpse of something deeper, a reflection of the growing accountability that can no longer be ignored. But the real question remains, will it be enough to stop what's coming next? And when the world watches, will it make a difference? The camera cuts, the screen going black. The story isn't over, it's only just begun. As the elderly man walks away, the sound of his cane tapping against the concrete is the only noise breaking the tense silence that has settled over the park. The crowd begins to thin out, people murmuring among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief and quiet relief. The officer who had originally confronted the elderly man stands frozen for a moment, watching him leave, his eyes hard, but filled with something else now. Uncertainty, maybe even regret. The second officer, the one who stepped in, doesn't look back at him, his attention still on the elderly man as he slowly walks out of view. The woman who had spoken up, the one who had captured everything on camera, watches the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She lowers her phone, the screen still recording, capturing the last few seconds of the encounter. She feels a sense of power in that moment, the power of speaking out, the power of standing up for what's right. But even as the immediate threat seems to dissipate, she knows this isn't just about one encounter, one incident. This is part of a larger conversation that's still unfolding in every corner of society. The woman's thoughts are interrupted when a voice calls out to her. It's a man, another bystander who had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He approaches her cautiously, as if unsure of whether to speak. "You did good," he says, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. I wasn't sure what would happen if you didn't speak up." She nods, feeling a warmth in her chest, though it's tinged with the weight of what they all just witnessed. It wasn't just me. We all saw it, and we all had to do something. The man nods, glancing around at the others who remain, unsure of how to process what they've just seen. It's clear that the impact of the confrontation has shaken them all. There's no going back from this. People have seen the power of standing up, of holding those in authority accountable. As the elderly man finally disappears from sight, the second officer walks over to the first, who still stands by the bench, seemingly lost in thought. The tension between them is palpable, but neither speaks. The second officer casts a glance at the crowd, then at the phone cameras still recording from a distance. He lets out a quiet sigh. The first officer doesn't respond immediately. His lips tighten, and he turns to face the second officer, his expression dark. He knows the truth that is now undeniable. There is no escaping the accountability that the cameras and witnesses bring. This wasn't a situation that could be swept under the rug. It was a turning point, not just for him, but for all of them. His eyes flicker with a mix of frustration and fear, but he doesn't speak. After a moment of silence, the second officer shakes his head and walks away, leaving the first officer standing there, staring out at the empty space where the elderly man had just been. There is no resolution for him, not yet. His thoughts seem to swirl in uncertainty, a question mark hanging over him. How far would he have gone if no one had intervened? How much longer would the cycle of power abuse continue if it weren't for those who were brave enough to stand up? Back in the park, the woman, still standing with her phone in hand, finally puts it down. Her fingers feel heavy, the weight of the moment settling in. She wasn't just a passive observer, she had played a role in this, and in doing so, had become part of something much bigger. The elderly man's words still echo in her mind. "I will not be silenced." Those words had carried a message that reached far beyond that single moment. She looks around at the few remaining people, many of them still standing in stunned silence. Some are walking away, shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering quietly to one another. It's clear that what they witnessed today won't be something easily forgotten. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reflection of a larger struggle, one that is happening everywhere, in every corner of the world, and this park was just one place where the tide began to shift. The woman walks away, her heart heavy but determined. As she passes through the park gates, she feels the weight of what just transpired. The moment is over, but it's not the end. This isn't a story that wraps up neatly, with a clear-cut resolution. There's no tidy ending here. The officer may have backed down this time, but the larger issues at play are far from resolved. The video she has recorded will spread, as it always does. But what will that spark? Will it inspire others to speak out? Will it bring about real change, or will it be another story, forgotten in the noise of the next viral video? As she walks through the streets, she feels the eyes of the city around her. The world is watching now, and it's time to keep the conversation going. People can't afford to look away, not anymore. The struggle for justice, the fight for accountability, it's ongoing, and it's up to everyone to keep pushing, keep speaking up, and keep fighting for a world where the elderly, the vulnerable, and all those oppressed are heard, seen, and treated with dignity. The elderly man, wherever he is now, knows this too. His brief moment of defiance has left a mark, not just on the officer, but on everyone who witnessed it. His courage, his refusal to be intimidated, has inspired others to find their own voices. And though the story today ends with the man walking away, his dignity intact, the true resolution is far from here. It will unfold slowly as the ripple effects of this moment spread out, moving through the streets, the communities, and the conversations of those who care enough to make sure it doesn't fade away. Because this is just one story among countless others, and the fight for justice, for human dignity, for accountability, it's far from over. The screen fades to black, and the silence that follows is filled with the weight of the world watching, waiting for the next step, the next story, the next moment when someone will stand up and say, "I will not be silenced."